Hello everybody, we are a group of presenters of the Mastership in English as a Foreign Language at UCB University. Today we are going to talk about the whole woman, sex and gender differences in variation. This is an article written by Eckert in 1990. Now, the points to be discussed are introduction, assumptions, interpretation and sex differences in variation, hierarchy, sex difference as opposition, power, status, and other things, gender and adolescent social categories, phonological variation, conclusions, and finally the two questions. Well, when we have in mind sex and gender, we had to take into consideration that, like age, sex is a biological category that serves as a fundamental basis for the differentiation of roles, norms, and expectations in all societies. It is these roles, norms, and expectations that constitute gender, the social construction of sex. As we may know, gender is a social construction, meanwhile, sex is something that is biological. Differences in patterns of variation between men and women. Directly, we have a function of gender, and indirectly a function of sex within and between sex groups. The method used by the author in his analysis of the data is going to be the interpretation between gender and variation has been examined by correlating variables with sex rather than gender differences. In this case, gender is considered as a multidimensional complex variable. Meanwhile, sex is generally observable binary variable. So the author states that it's better to study gender through to study the relationship between variables and gender through sex. In sex, data can be gathered without any inquiry into the construction of gender in that community. In gender, differences are exceedingly complex. Changes in society are calling traditional gender roles into question nowadays. Now, assumptions. There are two main assumptions that researchers usually have when they start considering gender. There is no apparent reason to believe that there is a simple constant relation between gender and variation. As we said before, this is something multidimensional. Then, there is no apparent reason to believe that there is a simple constant relation between gender and variation. We must separate our interpretation of sex differences in variation from artifact service categories. Variations based on gender may not always be adequately accounted for in terms of binary opposition. Now, interpretation of sex in variation. We had a misconception that women's speech is more conservative than men's. The truth is that vernacular forms that represent social values are those forms used more by women. Then there is also a misconception that according to which women lead in sound change. Of course, they participate in these kind of changes, but not always they are the only one. Now, it is a mistake to claim any kind of constant associated with gender. Men and women are perceived as categorically different, indeed and opposed, in their use of linguistic variables. Then, sex does not have the same effect on language use everywhere in population. That is something very important. Now, according to this study of Trudgill in 1972, the hierarchy women use overt standard language prestige norms, thus refined qualities, cosmopolitan marketplace, powerless position in society. And according to this, women are more pledged to use overt standard language because they are powerless in society. Then we have men. They use covert prestige vernacular language norms for the most. Now, there we have the kinds of prestige. We have the global prestige based on norms imposed in the standard language marketplace. We have the covert prestige based on the opposition to those standard norms, and they also have the local prestige, which is based on membership in the local community. Now, sex differences as opposition. Variables that function as something like gender markers must have some iconic value. Is someone aware to think of variables as social markers, then one might expect gender markers to behave quite different from markers of class or ethnicity. Marks genders used by males and females respectively is more a device for competing with others of the same category and creating solidarity with those in the same category.
Power, status, and other things, we continue with the opposition between men and women. In the case of men, we have that they have this whole this productive role, and they hold the power instead of women. They are limited to the domestic realm, and they don't have any kind of power. The decisions are not taken by them. So what they do to become an authority is to recruit to the moral aspect, and then they have to conform with what is with the status. So when we have in the article the section related to gender, adolescent, social categories, we have that these adolescent girls, have realized that they don't have equal access to power, and the only hope that they have to get any kind of authority or status is through popularity. While the boys must show off their accomplishments, the girls must display their personas. Okay, we have a phonological variation. This study made by Eckert took two different sets of categories into account. In this case, we have high school in a suburb of Detroit, where she took a group of students during their last 2 years of high school. Okay, in the case of this high school, we have that it serves a community that is wide, but they have or show different variations in terms of ethnicity because of the Western and Eastern Europe population. They also have different classes, social classes in terms of their students. Some of them are from lower working classes, others are from the middle class or the upper middle class. And another thing that is important to mention is that in the case of speakers of Detroit, they are involved in the northern cities change switch. In this case, Eckert took 5 different references account for this analysis. Yeah, three of them were categorized like old changes, and 2 of them as new. In the case of the conclusions, she find out that girls tended to use more these old changes, and in the case of the new changes, they became a social symbol for self-presentation for these little women. Okay, as conclusions for this research, Eckert said that sex and social category are not necessarily independent variables, but they can interact in a very significant way. And finally, search for explanation of sex differences in phonological variations should be redirected. some analysis of sex differences have suffered from the lack of information about women. So, she expressed that some labels are not so simple as they seem. And finally, I would like to share two questions with you. The first one is, how do you think sex and gender have influenced your language teaching? And the second one is, have you used language as a tool to reveal or accept the gender roles? How?